Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is APUS History, Chapter 21. Today we're going to be talking about America and the Great War. I want to get started off today talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and we haven't spent a lot of time on Teddy Roosevelt, but we did talk a little bit about him during the Spanish-American War, and obviously he was involved heavily there with the Rough Riders and gained a lot of fame from that period of time. So now we come to Teddy Roosevelt as president, and he's going to be president here in the early 1900s, and his policy with what we call the civilized and uncivilized nations of the world is speak softly and carry a big stick. And this idea creates a whole new mantra around Roosevelt, and Roosevelt believes that the civilized people, which tend to be white nations or nations with a lot of white people, and then these uncivilized nations are Slavic or Latin or non-white nations. And so he believed in his mind that civilized nations could and should intervene in these uncivilized nations. And this was a very different approach for the United States during this time. It's important that you understand the United States is very isolated towards the rest of the world up until this point. Were we trading with other nations? Sure. Were we involved in certain little things? Sure. But in terms of the way that America is involved in today's society, wasn't even close. And so it's important for you to note that America being involved in anything in Europe or in Latin America or overseas from a military standpoint or direct military involvement was very rare. And we see that change kind of beginning to happen during the Spanish-American War, and we talked a lot about that then. So this is kind of that continuation of the change from isolationism to more of an imperialistic practice from the United States. Now, Japan and Russia had begun to fight in around 1905 in what is known as the Russo-Japanese War. And Japan was humiliating Russia with its superior navy. And you can see the sands of time running out on the Tsar of Russia. And it's only going to get worse for the Tsardom, excuse me. When we get into World War I, that's going to be where Germany's going to actually spend some time trying to get rid of the Tsar, but we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Now, Japan secretly comes to Teddy Roosevelt and asks him to basically reach a peace agreement between Japan and Russia. And their fighting was going on, your book talks about right there in Manchuria, province of China. And it was important not only for America, but all these other countries to ensure that no one country had excessive control over Manchuria or just over this area, because China was still one of its main trading partners and was going to be really important going in the future for there to be an open door policy in that area. And so Teddy Roosevelt ends up reaching an agreement known as the Treaty of Portsmouth, which actually wins him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. And then in 1906, later on that year, we see in San Francisco, the school board begins to segregate Asian students. And we see this kind of rising tension about Japanese people in the United States. And you're going to start to see these tensions begin to mount. And guys, if you were talking about what led to the attack of Japan in World War II on America, this is kind of the beginnings of it. We've got this open door policy into Japan, and we've tried to help them in various ways and work some different agreements, but you're starting to see kind of a rise in nativism in our country during this time specifically. And Teddy Roosevelt and Japan are able to reach a gentleman's agreement, and essentially Japanese immigrants would stop coming into the U.S., and they would do that by Japan withholding passports, so they couldn't actually get out of the country. Now, the issue is there's going to be a ton of various nativist acts passed during this time where they're trying to limit immigration, they're trying to limit, and not just Japanese people. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had various other Japanese acts that withheld them from coming to the country. And it's going to create other problems because now we're going to have to turn to migrant workers in a lot of these farms and businesses. And these migrant workers are coming in illegally from Mexico, and they're essentially not paying any form of taxes or anything of that nature. And so what happens is it's almost kind of like slavery of a different style. And that's what you constantly see as issues is, you've got American companies who are trying to use Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants as cheap labor. Then when they're limited because the government's trying to help the economy by forcing it to go towards Americans, then they turn to a different group that's illegally here. It's constantly a problem for the country. The biggest problem is it's just a constant issue with nativist practices. Now, we come to the Roosevelt Corollary, and your textbook gave a really good definition of what this was. But essentially, Latin American countries owed a lot of money to Germany and Britain specifically. I believe there was another country in there as well. Italy was the other one. But Roosevelt used the threat of American naval power to pressure the German Navy to withdraw. And essentially what happens here is by the U.S. pushing these countries away and saying that, hey, you're not going to come over here, they were enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, which said that you could not intervene or that you could not settle in the Western Hemisphere. And Germany specifically, there was rumors they were going to try to set up a permanent settlement. And so this Roosevelt Corollary actually said that in the future, in terms of financial instances, the U.S. would intervene and pay off the debts. The other issue here is that it also meant that the U.S. was going to intervene specifically in foreign affairs. And I'm going to read you this little section. The United States, he claimed, had the right, this is Roosevelt, had the right not only to oppose European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, but also to intervene in the domestic affairs of its neighbors, if those neighbors proved unable to maintain order or national sovereignty. Okay. The immediate motivation of this corollary and first opportunity for using it was a crisis in the Dominican Republic. Revolution toppled its corrupt and bankrupt government in 1903, but the new regime proved no better able than old to make good on its country's $22 million debt to European nations. Using the rationale provided by Roosevelt established in effect an American receivership, assuming control of the Dominican customs and distributing 45% of the revenues to the Dominicans. Now, all that said, the important thing to understand here is that the United States is going to now intervene in Latin American affairs, and we already saw this in the Mexican-American War. In the Mexican-American War, the United States got involved in Cuba and, issues with Spain there and essentially helped overthrow the Spanish government. Then we're involved in the Philippines as well during that time because we had an interest there. Then we've got a civil war going on in the Philippines for years to come. Okay, and all that's taking place during this early 1900s. Okay, let me fix this picture real quick. All right, so we see that the impact of the corollary was the U.S. is now more involved in Latin America, but you're also going to see a lot of resentment from Latin American countries. Now, moving on further, we're going to see the U.S. get involved in the Panama Canal. Now, this is very vital to the U.S.'s interest, and it makes sense why. We spent 100 years or 150 years looking for a northwest passage that would take us to the Pacific coast. It only made sense that that is still a dream, that you can go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean without having to sail all the way around the tip of South America, but instead somewhere as a shortcut in the middle. And that was what the Panama Canal would provide. It cut down travel time for shipping, and so the United States is going to help negotiate the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty of 1901, which gave the U.S. the right to build the canal and the right to fortify it. Okay, Colombia, which then controlled Panama, rejected the treaty to give the U.S. a right to build the canal. And then November 3rd of 1901, a rebellion starts in Panama, influenced by the United States. Now, this is kind of once again what I'm talking about with the change from being isolated and this isolationism practice to now we're being much more influential as a country going forward. And Roosevelt was very set on we have to get this canal through, and it's going to lead to some issues. Now, as we get past the Panama Canal, obviously the United States ends up being able to buy the contract and take control of the canal. We're going to start to see others begin to influence the country following Roosevelt. And one of those influences was Taft and his dollar diplomacy. And I want to read you this little section about Taft. And actually, real quick, I want to take one step back. I rushed through it there towards the end. Roosevelt, there with the Panama Canal, after organizing the revolution, they recognized Panama as an independent nation and quickly agreed to terms the Colombian Senate had rejected with the United States. To work on the canal proceeded rapidly and opened in 1914. So essentially 11 years later, the United States has gotten what it wanted. This is going to be important because when we get to Taft and we get to his dollar diplomacy, Many people criticized him because he had this idea that they should use dollars instead of bullets to influence other countries. And they would help other countries while making money for the United States. There was a ton of influence from Wall Street to invest in other areas of the country, or in other areas of the world, I should say, and that's going to be the influence there. When a revolution broke out in Nicaragua in 1909, the administration quickly sided with the insurgents, sent American troops into the country to seize the custom houses. As soon as peace was restored, Knox encouraged American bankers to offer substantial loans to the new government, thus increasing Washington's financial leverage over the country. When the new pro-American government faced an insurrection less than 2 years later, Taft again landed American troops in Nicaragua, this time to protect the existing regime. The troops remained there for more than a decade. So, yes, they're still using a show of force, but then you use money to influence the nation. It's important that you understand dollar diplomacy and how it works. You use your money and the influence of other companies in your country that then go in and they control them from a financial standpoint. It's seemingly, I don't know that we actually talked a lot about it in APUSH going through the text, but the United Fruit Company by Minor C. Keith that developed in the Dominican, that company dominated the politics of that area because that fruit company was so powerful that they became an economic influence in the country. And that's the thing you need to remember about imperialism. When you're talking about dollar diplomacy and you're talking about how it influenced imperialism, dollar diplomacy specifically gives you power over a country's economy. And in this case, the United States has power over Nicaragua and these other countries that it's financially invested in because they can control whether or not that economy stays up or down, which in turn forces the government to rely on America. So remember, 3 parts of imperialism. You can dominate someone economically, politically, or militarily. In this case, we're using the military, but in reality, we're using the economy to dominate this country. Now, moving past Taft, now we're moving really quickly through the presidents here into getting closer to World War I. Woodrow Wilson entered his presidency with really, little interest in international affairs, and a lot was going on when Woodrow Wilson entered the presidency. Obviously, Roosevelt was trying to run again as president, and you had Taft, who essentially had strengthened much of the foreign policy that Roosevelt had kind of done. But thankfully, at least for our country, because it was a good thing in the long run, maybe not the right way to handle things, Woodrow Wilson kind of strengthened our foreign policy and the approach to foreign policy that Roosevelt and Taft had had. And I want to read you this little section. In Haiti, Wilson landed Marines in 1915 to intervene in the Caribbean, quell a revolution during which a mob had murdered an unpopular president. Military forces remained there until 1934. Let's see. When Wilson began to fear that Danish West Indies might be about to fall into the hands of Germany, he bought the colony from Denmark and renamed it the Virgin Islands. Concerned about the possibility of European influence in Nicaragua, he signed a treaty with that country's government, allowing intervention to protect American interests. So, Woodrow Wilson, I want to put that in perspective for you, is very, very heavily involved in foreign affairs. He just didn't have any interest when he came into office as a president. Now, closer to the American border, there's still issues going on with many immigrants coming across, as well as there's a lot going on in Mexico during this time. The corrupt dictator Porfirio Diaz had long permitted American businessmen to be very profitable in Mexico. But in 1910, Diaz was overthrown by Francisco Madero, and he promised a democratic reform. It was very hostile towards American business. Now, that creates a lot of tension. The United States quietly encouraged a reactionary general, Victoriano Huerta, to dispose of Maduro in 1913. But when the new government murdered Madero, Woodrow Wilson announced that he would never recognize Huerta's government of butchers. So essentially, they encouraged this guy to get involved, and then, never worked out. Then we come to Pancho Villa. Okay, Wilson envisioned a bloodless action, but a clash of Mexican troops led to Americans killing 126 of its defenders and suffered 19 casualties. But his show of force helped strengthen the position of the Carranza faction, which captured Mexico City in August 1914 and forced Huerta to flee the country. Okay? And then, let's see here. Here we go. But Wilson reacted angrily when Carranza, whom he had previously supported, refused to accept American guidelines. So once again, America being involved economically. Carranza's erstwhile, as your book called it, Lieutenant Pancho Villa, now staking his own claim to power. Villa's military position deteriorated, however, Wilson abandoned him and granted preliminary recognition to Carranza. Villa, angrily at what he considered an American betrayal, retaliated in early 1916 by shooting 16 American mining engineers in northern Mexico and 17 more Americans across the border in Columbus, New Mexico. So essentially what we're going to get into here is that Pancho Villa is trying to plan his own rebellion. And, Mexico's going through this constant flow of leadership and someone's trying to establish their dominance as the leader. And America keeps trying to back different leaders, but it never seems to work out. Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing to lead an American expeditionary force across the Mexican border in an unsuccessful pursuit of Villa. They did engage in two ugly skirmishes, but before a fuller war could erupt, Wilson quietly withdrew American troops from Mexico, and in 1917 finally granted formal recognition to the Carranza regime. By now, however, Wilson's attention was turning to a far greater international crisis. Okay, so they never caught Pancho Villa, but you're going to see the involvement of various men in across the border, Pershing specifically. You're also going to see, just a random fact, the creation of, during this war, mini war I should say, you're going to see the creation of the mobile fighting vehicle. Okay, so you've got the creation of cars already here in the early 1900s, and they're going to realize that they can put a gun on a car and drive the car and shoot the gun while they're driving. Okay, and that's one of the inventions that comes out of this little war. And that brings us to the end of the war and World War I. So I'm going to stop right there. This will be the first part of chapter 21. This is a very long chapter, so I'm going to break it up into a couple of different lectures. And we will pick up with World War I here in part number 2. Talk to you then.